What's happening, everyone? Hey, welcome back to another episode of the Adventure Box Podcast. Zach Edwards here, the CEO of Historical Conquest, the company that's bringing these podcasts. I hope you're enjoying them. We have actually changed a lot since our first episode. We are now, 29 weeks in? And we've learned a lot when it comes to podcasting. Now, they're not the best podcast yet. We're still improving. We could use your help. If you find something that's an issue, please let me know. Put them in the comments below. Email us. Whatever you want to do. We want to hear what your thoughts are because we want to make this as best as possible. Today, we're going to be talking about how Alexander Hamilton... Wait. I've got a picture of him. How this guy almost screwed up the country. Yep. So we have this great Broadway show about him, and it puts him in such great lights. But there's some things about him that you don't really know about, such as his plans. What were some of his plans? Now, Alexander Hamilton was put in a very hard place. Now, actually, before we get into this, we're going to talk about two things: Whiskey Rebellion and Alexander Hamilton's financial plans, his way of saving the country. He wanted to create a national bank, basically to take in, the federal government would take some of the states' debts and also establish tariffs. That's his financial plan. We're going to go into each part of those. The Whiskey Rebellion is actually where basically his policies got all the people up in arms and how George Washington handled that. And again, thank you, George Washington, for being so brilliant and saving the country. Okay, so these are two great stories. They work hand in hand on how the economy of the United States was formed. Okay, so after the American Revolution, the U.S. economy was in shambles. One, it didn't have a dollar. That's right. There was no money. They had greenbacks. They had all these different things. All the different states were thinking of creating their own money. All these things were happening. And again, this man was put in charge of it. And so he was put in a very, precarious state, a hard state. There was a lot of opposition to him and what he thought they could do. So there are three pillars to his financial plan. One, the assumption of states' debts. The states were in a lot of debt after the American Revolution. We're going to go into that in just a minute. The second thing is the creation of the national bank. So we're going to go over this. And the third one was tariffs. Okay, so these are all different things that were very important. Watch out for the tariffs one. We're going to get into that. Because there's a lot of things that happened back then that are happening right now. Now, you might think I'm talking about certain things, but you'll be surprised because when we get to the tariffs, I'm going to take it in a different direction than you might be thinking. Okay, first one, the assumption of states' debts. During the American Revolution, each state had borrowed money, basically to fund their militias and their operations. There was the Continental Congress, but there was also state militias, which helped out the Continental Army, but also were there to keep that that colony in check, to keep it free from the British. So Hamilton proposed that the federal government assume those debts, and to create a stronger national economy. A one-time assumption of debt and allowing the states to be able to start over. Because, again, those debts were actually for the fact that we were able to have the American Revolution and win the American Revolution. So some states, like Massachusetts and South Carolina, which were very high in debt, one southern state, one northern state, they loved this idea. They were all about this idea. But others, like Virginia and North Carolina, again, those are both southern states, had already paid off most of their debts and didn't want to be taxed on other people's debts. So, now, we were talking about what was the income for the national government? Well, actually, there was no income. They couldn't tax until the Constitution was signed. They couldn't do anything with trade. So there wasn't any revenue in that way. The only thing they could do was go to the states and say, hey, we need money. So they basically taxed the states. Now, that was in a little bit of debt. The federal government had a little bit of debt. It was the states that had the majority of the debt. And so the federal government said, we're going to assume that debt. Now, the big states that were highly in debt, they wanted to get relief. The other states that already paid off their debt said, we don't want to have their debt and have to pay off their debt. So there's a compromise. 1790, Hamilton struck a deal with Thomas Jefferson. Hamilton, Federalist. Thomas Jefferson, a little bit less, anti-Federalist. And also James Madison. In exchange for support, they agreed to move the national capital to a southern state. What? Yeah, so in order for the states to agree to assume all this debt, they had to move the capital, which started in Pennsylvania, moved to New York, and then now moved to Washington, D.C. Virginia was a southern state, remember. So Washington, D.C. became its own district, not a state, its own district in that area, which does not have the same voting rights as every state out there. Okay, on to the second point. So that was the end of his first pillar that basically made up the economy, the finances of the federal government. Second pillar, a national bank. Hamilton wanted to create a Bank of the United States, modeled basically after the Bank of England. This national bank would issue a unified currency. Now remember, the states are already creating their own currency. There's a lot of different currencies going around. Most of them had no money behind them, or didn't have a lot of money behind them. The second thing is he wanted to provide loans to businesses. Loan to a business, the business pays back interest. Well, that's great because that will bring in a little bit more money. Okay, yeah, so that I can agree upon that. But that's the national bank loaning the money. Okay, so I don't like the national banks. I do like loans to businesses. Now, the third one is it would store government funds. So the national bank, gold. We have Fort Knox. Basically, this bank would store the money generated from taxation and everything else in one spot, in a national bank. Jefferson, Madison both opposed it, again, because they wanted more states' rights and not a larger centralized federal government. They argued that the Constitution didn't specifically allow for a national bank. So Hamilton tried to get them to agree on this. So Hamilton used the necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8, the Constitution. It's to basically, this is how he justified it. Washington came in and had to be the deciding factor. Washington approved, and the bank approved the agreement, and the bank was established in 1791, around the exact same time as the Bill of Rights. Now, again, remember, Jefferson and Madison both wanted the Bill of Rights. Hamilton was against the Bill of Rights in the sense that he wanted the federal government to be very strong and central. So, this is one of the reasons why Washington actually approved the National Bank, was because there was a compromise of Bill of Rights, National Bank. Okay, I'm giving you both something you want. So, can we agree on this? And they agreed upon it. They allowed it to happen. I won't say agreed upon it. They allowed it to happen. Third pillar. So, National Bank and assuming the state's debts. The last one. This is the most important part, because this is how basically you fund the whole federal government. Tariffs and taxes. Okay, so to raise funds, Hamilton proposed tariffs on all imported goods to protect American industry. Oh, wait a second. I think Trump is doing that right now. So Trump is doing tariffs on basically three different types of he's doing three different types of tariffs. One, border tariffs. Border tariffs are basically the tariffs that are happening in Mexico and Canada in order for them to secure their own border with the United States. We're securing the borders. He wants them, Mexico and Canada, to also secure the borders so that drugs and illegal immigrants cannot come over the border. So here's just a stat. I think it was like 100,000 immigrants came over in a single day, in one of the days that Biden was in play. 12,000? I think the highest was 100,000, but let's say, just say even 12,000. You know how many are going over in a single day right now? About 150 to 200 illegal immigrants. People that are not going through the process of trying to come in here legally. Which, again, I have plenty of friends that all came over here legally from India, from Mexico, actually from Canada as well. Actually, some that came from Samoa, because there's an American Samoa and French Polynesian, French Samoa. So I have all these friends that have come over legally because that's the law. They did it. Well, nowadays, Trump has his border tariff, basically saying that if you don't secure your border, I'm going to put a tariff on both Canada and Mexico, some of our biggest traders. They trade with us more than any other country. Okay. So Hamilton decides he wants a tariff on all imported goods. Oh, sorry, that was just the first one. The second one is a, what was it called? Basically a balancing. If someone's giving, if someone's going to put tariffs on our goods going into their country, we're going to do the same type, I think, nullified tariff. Basically, we're going to give a tariff to their imported goods at the same rate. They tax our goods 25%. We're going to tax their goods 25%. He's hoping that they're just going to wipe out the tariffs. Get rid of the tariffs. Trump says, that's fine. Done. No tariffs. If that government puts away their tariffs, we as well will put away our tariffs. And then there's also another type of tariff, and this is one to basically push for certain things that need to happen. Okay, so there are things happening around the world that Trump, as our president, decides that he does not like, or that the country doesn't like. Again, he's given a mandate, he's forcing it, he's pushing it. So let's just say China. Do you know that there are slaves, actually Muslim slaves? Nike doesn't care about them. Apple doesn't care about them. All these other large companies, they don't care about them because they make their goods for so cheap, and they're in cahoots with China. But if Trump wanted to, he could say, until you free those slaves, unless you stop using slave work, we're going to put a tariff on you. Now, he could do that. He's not doing that. That's not one of the things that he's actually doing at this point. Some of us would love for that to happen because there should not be slavery anywhere in the world. In the United States, there are still slaves. Just so you know, they're not like African American slaves that are being forced to work on plantations. They are children that are working in sweat factories. There are other people that are doing things that they would not want to do and are forced to do it by their cartels, which is one of the reasons why Trump is trying to get all of the criminal illegals out of the country. If you have people forcing people into different acts that they would not do on their own volition, on their own choosing, then you need to be able to get them out so those people that are being oppressed can be freed. So I think that's an honorable thing to do. So there are certain taxes that are tariffs that are going out. Now, another thing that Trump would love to do at some point is use tariffs to create revenue for the federal government and get rid of all income tax. I don't actually see that one passing. Would that be a great thing? To some extent. It would increase the prices of everything, but then we wouldn't be paying as much in taxes. So it's like a give and take. When you go to work, they're not going to be taking money out of your paycheck for federal income tax. That would be tariffs that would pay that money. So that's a really interesting thing. Here's the part where Alexander Hamilton almost screws up. He puts a tax on whiskey. Now, I remember we're going to be talking about the Whiskey Rebellion, right? Okay, here we go. Let's go into whiskey. What was whiskey? It's a type of alcohol. Type of alcohol that people really enjoyed because it was easy to make. 2, they thought it was good, but I would never touch it. And so this was a very, very popular drink. It's like saying because they drink it so much. It's like saying I'm putting a tax on all wine. Okay, so a tariff on all wine that was basically produced outside of the legal bounds. Basically, if you have a established company, you could create wine, but you could not distill it yourself. You could not make it on your own. Another reason why whiskey was so important is people used whiskey when they couldn't pay their bills. Hey, you know what? I owe you $1. How about this bottle of whiskey instead? And I can pay my debt with whiskey that I make. And people accepted, especially on the frontier, where really there wasn't much for currency. And because there wasn't much for currency, and also some of the veterans, those that fought in the American Revolution, weren't being paid as they should have, like with a pension, they turned to bootlegging or making their own distilling whiskey and trading with others to pay their bills, including their mortgage. We talked about this. What was it called? Oh, shoot. What was the rebellion that we talked about, I think, like 2 weeks ago, where, I don't remember where it was. Basically, the courts were foreclosing on a lot of land. These were farmers, veterans, and everyone, and they were basically taking that land from them. So they created a rebellion and came outside the courthouses just to hold on to it. It's someone's name, and it's just losing. I lost it right now. Anyways, okay. So this was where he almost screwed up. While tariffs boosted domestic businesses, the whiskey tax would cause a major rebellion. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Last part of Hamilton's plan, or basically why it matters. Okay, so Hamilton's plan saved the country from financial collapse. This was a point where we had no taxes, income tax. At this point, to this point, we didn't have tariffs that we could actually put on other countries and imported goods to tax them. So we were running out of money. We had a huge amount of debt on our heads. And this is the way that Alexander Hamilton figured out how to overcome that. It basically established a modern economic system still used today, including a national banking system, which a lot of us might not agree on, but a banking system, a unified banking system, which we do agree on. It's like the Fed that people don't agree on. And we'll go into that later on. Basically, when we talk about when the Fed was created, we'll come into that. It stabilized a currency. His plan allowed for a U.S. dollar. And also a federal government that could raise money. That's right. To run a federal government, you have to have money to run it, to pay the people that are working with you, and all those things. It also led to America's first political divide. Federalists, this is more than the second. Well, but this is the first because this is after the Constitution was ratified. Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. That sounds familiar because now it's like Republican versus Democrat. But this is the Democratic Republicans. Federalists were for a strong federal government and banking system. The Democratic Republicans favored states' rights and feared a big bank. Talk about debanking people, not allowing people to bank with you because you deal in certain things or you run a business that they don't agree on. Yeah, that's the problem. Okay, so let's get into this whiskey rebellion. While Hamilton's plan stabilized the economy, it also sparked outrage among many rural Americans and led them to the first armed challenge to the federal authority. Again, this is after the Constitution was ratified. So the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794. So why was there a whiskey tax? We already talked about it. The country was, it was in huge amounts of debt and it could not raise money. This was one of the ways that Alexander Hamilton decided to raise money. The federal government needed that money to run. So Hamilton introduced a tax on whiskey production in 1791. The Whiskey Rebellion took 3 years to actually form, and it did not last long. For farmers, whiskey wasn't just a drink. Again, it was a currency. Farmers in, say, like Pennsylvania, Kentucky, basically frontier states, relied on whiskey for trade and survival. And all of a sudden, you were outlawed from distilling it. To them, it wasn't just a tax on liquor. It was a direct attack on their way of life. So the rebellion basically began with farmers refusing to pay and attacked the tax collectors. It wasn't just that they would pay or wouldn't pay, it's that they actually attacked the tax collectors. By July in 1794, a mob of 500 armed men burned down the tax inspector's house. That was over in Pittsburgh. And this was the first major test of the federal government with the ability to enforce laws, federal laws. Again, Alexander Hamilton gave a federal law, being that the whiskey would be taxed. And so this was the first opposition to enforce federal law. Now, this is why... No, wait a second. I'm going to show you some of the images that I had. This is like an image of showing of them distilling whiskey. The whiskey's up here in a big pot, fire underneath, and such. And this is rye from their fields. Okay. Washington. Why, again, was Washington so important? Washington was a unifier. But at this point, he actually had to send an army after farmers and normal citizens. This would create a big divide. Or would it? Now, Washington, again, a military general, was a president of the United States. He did not have to do this, but he personally led 13,000 federal troops to suppress the rebellion. It was the first and only time a U.S. president had ever gone to battle. Direct, personally leading his troops into battle. By October 1794, the rebellion dispersed without a battle. No battle. At this point, basically, Washington walked up and said, "Disperse, be gone." Only 2 men were convicted. And Washington, trying to keep the government unified, pardoned both of them. He showed mercy because he understood what they were going through. Yes, Washington was wealthy. That is well known. But at the same time, he was also in charge of keeping a government together. So he had to, well, and also his childhood was not as wealthy as he became back before he got married to someone that had, Martha Washington, had a large estate. And so he actually had understanding of both the wealthy and the not so wealthy. Now, why did the Whiskey Rebellion actually matter? Again, this is a rebellion that could have completely divided the country. That's one of the reasons why Washington had to go. And in the end, had to pardon both people that were convicted of violence and convicted of this rebellion. So why was it so important? This was the first test of the authority of not just the president, but the Constitution itself. That's why it was so important. It proved that the federal government could enforce laws, unlike under the weak Articles of Confederation. It also set precedent for handling domestic unrest and disputes and riots. Peaceful protests were protected, but armed rebellion, such as the Whiskey Rebellion, would not be tolerated. So Washington had to put his foot down. We will not divide this country. We will not allow you to break federal law. If this is the law that the legislature agreed upon, then this is the law that I will enforce as the executive. He's the greatest example of all executive powers, and the executive branch being worked for the people and the central government. Okay, so after the Whiskey Rebellion, Americans, they were left with 2 basic lessons, we'll say. Hamilton's financial plan worked. It created a stable economy and a strong government. At the same time, the U.S. government would enforce its laws, providing its authority over the states. But these events also deepened American political divide. So before, the government was the citizenship was very united. even if it was anti-federalists and federalists, they were still united as a people. But this is where you have the federalists breaking off and the anti-federalists and all else that were there creating the Democratic Republicans. And this saw the government's use of force as tyranny. That's what they saw it as. The use of force by federal government would be tyranny. And so Washington had to skirt this line very carefully. But this also goes into what would happen next. This was actually the political parties forming and the election of 1800. Remember, George Washington only served for 8 years, 1791 till 1799. 8 years. 2 elections. That's it. He wanted to set a precedent that you couldn't do any more than that. This rebellion, this division that was happening in the country would create 2 political parties fighting for 2 completely different things, different sides, which would then come to the election of 1800. So stay tuned for that for next week. Okay, let's go over this really fast, what we talked about. The Whiskey Rebellion and the Hamilton's financial plan. Basically just shaped 2 crucial parts of U.S. history and the way the U.S. government is run. Hamilton's plan stabilized the economy, and it gives it a central government and a financial system. Okay, those are very important. That's what he did. The Whiskey Rebellion proved that the government's authority and the Constitution could hold and could still keep the government together. 1794, the next election, or the first. So George Washington went into the next election, won it again, but the next election after his 2 terms would be where the actual divide really comes out. So that's 6 years. 6 years. Okay, so the Whiskey Rebellion proved the government's authority, but also exposed deep divisions between the rural Americans and the federal powers, the federal government. So here's your action question. What do you think? Was Hamilton's financial plan worth a rebellion it caused? Did he almost screw up? How could he have screwed up? What could have happened? Think about that. Now, I'm going to add one more action question for you. What would have happened with Washington if Washington was not there and it was somebody else? If somebody else was running that army, would they have attacked the farmers, and would that have been allowed? And would the U.S. government been able to come back together after that? I am, again, so grateful for President George Washington. And I will always be grateful for him for what he was able to do in the U.S. government. Did he do things wrong? Probably. But was he put in an almost impossible position? Most likely. Most definitely. He was put in this almost impossible position, and yet he still made it through and gave us the government that we have today and gave us the structure that we have today and helped us have the rights we talked about on Monday, the Bill of Rights, the rights that we have today. That's why George Washington was so important. That's why George Washington was essential for the United States to be here as it is today. And without him, I can almost guarantee it would not be where it is today. And it would not have been better off. It would have been worse off. So I thank God for a president to bring us all together, to set precedent when we're first designing this country so that we could actually have the freedoms that we have. So hat tip to him. And to all of you, thank you so much for joining us on this great Adventure Box podcast. We'll catch you next time. That would be tomorrow, as we're talking about ancient Persia still. We're about to go into ancient Greece, I think in a week or two. But ancient Persia, we're going to go through that. There's some really interesting things coming up with Darius and what happens with the fall of Persia. So stay tuned for that tomorrow. And if you're just listening for the early American history, next Monday. We will catch you next time on this great podcast. Have a great day. Take care, everyone. Bye. If you have any comments or questions, add them to the comments below. Otherwise, we'll see you tomorrow, actually. Take care. Bye.